Good morning, everybody. Today is November 9th, and we are now starting Module 6. Once again, with high flex and all that's going on, this is definitely an unusual semester. And with Module 5, I never actually talked about the Crusades. And so I know we had a quiz on it, but you just got to keep in mind the Crusades are really, really important. And so by all means, please make sure that you study those, study the material, because of course they'll be covered on exam 2, but more importantly, you kind of have to understand the Crusades to understand a lot of development that takes place after that. So we're starting Module 6 today. Obviously, Quiz 6 will open up a week from this Thursday, and for the most part, that's actually supposed to be kind of the end of the course material. So we're going to have about another week there where I don't have an exact set of course material, but there is some material that I'm going to want to talk about. We may watch a movie, so if you're wondering how we're going to close this class out, I promise you we'll have plenty to do. Also, of course, remember advisement, registration, get your schedule set for next semester, okay? If anybody has any questions about that, get in touch with me. Okay, we talked earlier about how Europe began to show very real improvement in overall quality of life beginning about the year 1000. Developments like the iron plow and the three-field system and horseshoes made food production go through the roof, which led to a diversified economy, a healthier population, et cetera, et cetera. And in a general sense, we can just say things got better. We all remember that. And although the Crusades were pretty nasty, once again, you'll study those, and they were part of Module 5, we know one very important metric that shows that society is doing well is the fact that the population increased considerably between about the year 1000 and 1300. It almost doubled. So clearly things are going well. Clearly life is getting better. Well, beginning about the year 1300, the 14th century, it all goes off the rails. A whole series of just catastrophic events throws this improving world into turmoil, and that's what I want to discuss now. And we will begin with the Black Death, or the plague, which struck not just Europe, but many parts of the Northern Hemisphere in the middle of the 14th century and was just utterly devastating. And to begin this discussion, I want to talk a little bit about how the Earth goes around the sun. You see, we all know that the Earth is rotating around the sun, and the Earth, of course, spins on its own axis, and the Earth is tilted just a little bit as it makes its yearly trip. Of course, it's not quite that simple. You see, the Earth also wobbles a little bit on its axis. It wibbles and wobbles back and forth, and this goes through cycles. So sometimes the angle is a little bit different. It also sometimes is more of a circle, and sometimes it's more of an ellipse in this orbit. And these small changes will have a very real impact on climate, because just a little bit of a tilt one way or the other can change the average temperature a few degrees up and down. And this just happens because it's how the Earth is. It's not that there's anything we're doing about it. The climate change that's happening today is man-made, but back in the day that wasn't the case. And around the year 1300, the Earth wobbled a little bit, and the climate got a bit colder in the Northern Hemisphere. Not much, certainly not enough that anyone would really notice at the time, at least not be able to measure. Nonetheless, it was the case. So winters are going to be a little bit colder, summers are going to be a little bit cooler. This also led to an increase in the rainfall. It just rains more. Now, farmers, we know, like rain. You got to have rain in order for your crops to grow. But of course, we can't have too much rain, because if it rains too much, we're going to have problems there, and that's what started to happen. Too much rain during the summer meant that the grain crops that were the staple of the European diet tended to lie down in the field and get wet and moldy and rot before they could be harvested. But also, of course, too much rain means it's hard to harvest your crops anyway. You get bogged down in the mud and you destroy a lot of the crop trying to get it all cut down. And so too much rain causes a lot of problems, and that's what we begin to see. So less food is being harvested. Now, farmers are used to this, societies are used to this. We can go one season, okay, maybe we don't eat quite as much, we tighten the belt, we lose a few pounds, that's okay. Next year it happens again, we sort of get through it. Again, we've had some bad harvests. It's not the end of the world. The problem is, of course, that this compounds. And one year after another will eventually lead to serious problems. And so after about 10 years of these rainy summers, this was no longer something that we can just sort of power through. Significant amounts of weight had been lost among the European population, so people are weaker. They don't have as much strength. They're not eating as much anyway, which means all those carbohydrates from the grain crops are not giving them the energy they need. It makes it a lot harder to harvest in that field. And it's muddy, which makes it even more difficult. At some point, people start getting so hungry and so desperate, they start eating their livestock. And that's only going to make the problem worse, because now we don't have the animals to pull the plows to begin with. You get the idea. A whole series of problems start popping up. People start eating food that they would normally throw out. Food that has gone bad. But of course, when you get hungry enough, that's what you'll do. And that's starting to get people sick. People will start getting digestive diseases from that sort of thing. In 1315, we see the first real famine in Europe, meaning large numbers of the population are now dying from starvation. This has gone from people being hungry and weak to people starving to death. And that famine lasted a couple of years. And we improved a little. The crops come back, but the rain kicks right back in. And so we start to see periodic famines now over the next few decades. Every couple of years, there's just not enough food. And it's a snowball effect. The amount of livestock we have starts to plummet because all the horses and cattle are now getting eaten. And now we can't harvest our crops. I've already mentioned that. Then things got bad. Things got very bad. We didn't, as I mentioned, discuss the Crusades, but one characteristic of the Crusades, I need to do this, sorry folks. One characteristic of the Crusades is that old trade routes reopened between the East and the West. The armies fought each other as the European armies attempted to reconquer the Holy Land. It didn't work. Sooner or later, those armies go home, but the businessmen and the traders keep it up. And so now ships are moving back and forth between northern Italy and what was then considered to be the East. The Black Sea region, the Turkish-controlled lands, what would become the Ottoman Empire. Venice, for example, did a lot of trading with that region. The Venetian merchants and the Turks established very strong trading relationships, but others did as well. And we already talked about how northern Italy was sort of the hub of business activity at this time. Well, there is a demand for these exotic Eastern products, among the wealthy, of course. And when there's money to be made, people are going to move the goods. I don't have a map here of Central Asia. We know that it is a very big place. And there was an established trade route from China across Central Asia and to the Black Sea. And you can see on this map right here, the eastern section of the Black Sea. goods would be loaded on boats right there from as far away as China and maybe even Japan. And these ships would then sail down into the Mediterranean, up into northern Europe, where people would buy it. A lot of this stuff would also come from India, and these were very expensive, the spices and such. Well, in 1347, one of these caravans is moving across toward the Black Sea, headed west, and everybody starts getting sick, real sick, and they die along the way. And others come across the stuff they were carrying and say, hey, free stuff, and they pick it up and keep it on going down the road. And eventually, the goods that they were carrying reach those Black Sea ports toward the end of the year, and they're loaded on boats from northern Italy. A lot of the stuff that we're talking about were textiles, blankets, stuff like that, rugs. This ship sails through the Bosphorus, crosses the Black Sea, sails into the Mediterranean. The sailors on board the ship start getting this disease. They start getting sick, and we're talking real sick. They're dying. And by the time it reached northern Italy, and it was the western side of northern Italy, it was a ghost ship. Everybody's dead. And the ship just washed ashore and crashed. And this now is 1348, and the people from the local village see that down there, and they don't think, hey, there's a ship with a lot of dead people on it, let's stay away. What do you think they were thinking? Free stuff. That's right. Exactly. You're right. Free stuff. So they all went down there, unloaded that stuff, carried it into their village, and that was a very bad idea. The disease we're talking about is the bubonic plague. It is a bacteria that gets into your lymphatic system. Now, we are, of course, familiar with our ordinary circulatory system, the veins, arteries, and capillaries that move blood around our body. But we also have an alternate system of vessels that moves a clear liquid called lymph. Now, you should remember this from, of course, your biology classes, but lymph is a cleaner. It goes throughout your body and kind of cleans your cells, and your lymph nodes produce it, and you have lymph nodes starting from your neck all the way down to your waist. You have dozens of them in your body, and they're all connected by these ducts, by these, vessels, and it's a system. It's a system. And the bacteria is voraciously damaging. It just eats your body apart from the inside out, of course. And once it gets into your lymph nodes, they swell up to the size of baseballs. It's excruciatingly painful. And it just travels throughout your body on your lymphatic system, going from node to node and just decomposing you while you are still alive. Blood and gunk start coming out of every orifice. You die within about 3 weeks, and it was nicknamed the Black Death because, of course, once you're dead, your body turns very dark. It is a horrific way to die, and the bubonic plague kills about 98% of the people that contract it. It has a 2% survival rate. And that's exactly what ended up in these Italian communities. Various types of really nasty diseases, of course, had been plaguing Western civilization and all civilization since antiquity. It is not entirely known whether or not the bubonic plague had been in Europe before. There are accounts of illnesses dating back to the Roman times that may have been bubonic plague, but we're not entirely sure because, to be honest with you, there's plenty of stuff that can kill people. But we certainly know that it was bubonic plague this time. Nobody knows why they're getting it, of course. They don't understand how bacteria works. But what they did know is that I'm getting out of Dodge. The minute people in their community start contracting this, they flee. They get out of there and they go north. And we know what that means. They carry it with them. They carry it with them. And over the course of about 4 years, the bubonic plague just marched further and further north. And there's various maps that show it. eventually reaching England and Scandinavia. And the rate at which it spread, and of course the tremendously high death rate, meant that it just devastated societies. Entire communities were wiped out, entire families were wiped out. And what came with it, of course, was just a complete collapse of the social order. The entire economic framework of Europe came to a halt, and a whole host of other problems are now also going to result in mass casualties. For example, food production now completely collapses, which means that starvation becomes a serious problem. We start to see all types of fighting and chaos happen as law and order is no longer maintained. There's nobody to keep the bad guys from doing the bad stuff. And so we see robbery and violence of all different types. The leadership, the kings and the nobility who were supposed to help solve these problems or provide guidance, wall themselves off. They put together their private armies and circle the wagons and refuse to go out into the community and help, much like they had actually been doing during the hunger of the past few years. They just make sure that they've got enough and then put up that wall. And nobody knows when this will end, or for that matter, what is even causing it. Now, what we now know is the bubonic plague is spread by flea bites. And the ships that stuff was loaded on had rats. Ships tend to have rats on them. And the textiles that were part of that trading caravan had fleas in them with the bubonic bacteria. And that bacteria got on the ships, the fleas got onto the rats. Of course, when they brought those goods into town, we've already talked about how medieval towns were pretty filthy, right? They had the walls around them, lots of garbage and trash that people throw out in the streets. That means a lot of rats. There you go. The fleas are living on the rats, the fleas bite the people, you got the plague. The extent to which the bubonic plague can be passed from person to person is still subject to dispute. There does appear to be evidence that it was also spread that way as people are coughing up blood, and you can see how that can happen. But the going transmission that most people experienced were the bites. And nobody really knows this. Society breaks down to such an extent, not only is there nobody to do the work, skilled craftsmen are no longer producing goods, farmers are now no longer harvesting food, there's nobody to do it. I mean, everybody's dead or sick or trying to take care of people who are dying. It gets to the point where they can't even properly bury bodies anymore. There's nobody to dig the graves, and there's no time to even deal with it. In these cities, they just dug huge trenches and just threw bodies in. Every day we've got 100, 200, 300 people, however many dying, and we don't have time to go through all of the process of proper funerals. The exact percentage of people that died from this is still not really even known. It is now believed that in London, for example, the plague killed 40% of the population. One researcher figured this out by going through wills. He actually read wills from this era. And in the wills and the records that would come with that. But of course, at some point, even records quit being taken because, again, everybody who can write stuff down is just not really able or willing to do it. We know that in China, where the plague is also hitting, it came from China and it was most definitely affecting China as well, about 13 million people died from it. Because, of course, the Chinese kept records too. One city that seemed to keep pretty good records was Cairo in Egypt. And yes, it spread into the Mediterranean as well. And in Cairo, during the peak of the plague, 10 to 15,000 people died every day. And Cairo was, of course, one of the biggest cities in the Western world, so you can kind of sort through that. Of course, trading ends all across the Mediterranean. Ships are now floating around with nobody on them. It's just horrific. Now, what are some of the other ways that people dealt with it? Well, obviously, people think that this is punishment from God, right? You can see that one coming. And all kinds of actions were taken to try and get God to lift the plague. One group of people, people praying all the time, one group of people were known as the flagellants. And what they would do is march around from place to place doing extreme forms of penance, whipping each other and whipping themselves, thinking that if we show how sorry we really are for being such sinners, God will lift the death. And giving yourself a whole bunch of big open wounds is not a good idea when something like this is going around. So I don't need to tell you that that was a bad idea. Many people abandoned the church, started adopting witchcraft and all kinds of weird religious beliefs. All kinds of bizarre and generally harmful medical treatments were tried. People taking potions and bleeding and all of this other stuff, which of course we know only made the situation worse. In some cases, we will see all types of irrational mob justice. Frequently, tragically, this was blamed on the Jews. And so slaughter of Jewish communities happened, where we all go in and they murder all of the Jews for being the heretics that they were perceived as being. Also, the burning of so-called witches happened quite frequently. Some people, of course, completely gave up and just partied like it's 1999. I'm just going to go out with a bang and no longer concern myself with anything else. I'm going to be dead tomorrow anyway, so I might as well have fun. You can connect the dots on everything that people would do. At one point, everybody thought it was the dogs, and so they went through all these communities, killing all the dogs. Didn't do any good. Then they decided it was the cats, and they went through all the communities, killing all the cats. That didn't do any good either, of course. For some reason, they didn't figure out it was the rats, right? If only they had gone one more step down the ladder, maybe they could have done some good, but that didn't happen. After about 4 years and an estimated 25% of the population dead, the plague kind of burned itself out. It moved so quickly and killed so rapidly that it kind of quit affecting the population so much. And just as people were trying to put society back together, the survivors, in 1361, it happened again. And another wave of the plague went through. And this time it killed about 10 to 20% of the population. Then, in 1369, it happened a third time. And about 10 to 15% of the population died. And usually when I have a full classroom, this exercise is a lot more fun. But I'll say if you were born in January, February, March, or April, you died of the plague. If you wonder, what would it have been me? Well, now you know. If you were born in May, June, or July, you died of something else. You didn't die of the plague, but you died of some other illness or some form of the violence that took place. If you were born in August, September, October, November, or December, you survived, but you are either severely ill and possibly affected for the rest of your life, or you had to do all the work and live through it and bury everybody that you know, because remember, everybody that you know that lived during those months is now dead too. So your life is forever altered and certainly not better off, much worse off. That's kind of one way to look at it. It is estimated that as a result of the plague and a lot of the other problems which we'll mention, by the year 1430, the European population was anywhere from 50 to 75% lower. 50 to 75% lower. And all of the progress that seems to have happened over the past couple of centuries, 3 or so, had more or less been erased. Now, by about 1370, by the time this third wave went through, and we're getting into the late 14th century, society had started to connect the dots between sanitation and not getting the plague. They didn't know why, but they knew that the cleaner areas don't seem to have a problem with it. And so they started cleaning up their cities and getting rid of the garbage, which reduced the rat supply, and that was that. But it never entirely went away. Outbreaks would happen in various communities. The last notable outbreak of the bubonic plague took place in 1771, and this was in Moscow, where 66,000 people died from it. And we have to go through these problems in order to learn, I suppose. As we move into the 19th century, and y'all can quit writing here, as we move into the 19th century, the germ theory of disease starts popping up. Scientists, notably Louis Pasteur, but a number of others, start to connect the dots between microorganisms and illness. And around the year 1900, a scientist, a biologist, had come to believe that it was a bacteria that was causing it. Now, they had already figured out that it was something with the lymph nodes, but they didn't know what. And he figured out it was a bacteria. And as I understand it, what he did was he actually snuck into a Chinese morgue with plague victims. And he wasn't supposed to be in there because, of course, you got to stay away from plague victims unless you get it yourself. But he went in there and he actually removed some of the lymph nodes from the bodies and dissected the lymph nodes and found the bacteria and isolated it and was able to put out a report. And at that point, everybody understands this is a bacteria. They then connected the dots with the fleas. And so very quickly, they were able to see how it is transmitted. And it is worth noting that the plague did make it to the United States, specifically in San Francisco. There was a big earthquake in San Francisco, I believe in 1908. And that created a lot of rats in the city because a lot of garbage and all of the reconstruction of San Francisco made it kind of a dirty place. And a ship docked in San Francisco from China. The ship had the plague on it. Some of those rats got off the ship into the city, and pretty quickly, people in San Francisco started coming down with it. And at that point, they understood what was going on, so they took care of it very quickly and got rid of all the rats, but the bacteria didn't entirely go away, and now it has escaped into the American Southwest. And so the small furry creatures crawling around in places like New Mexico and Arizona could conceivably be carrying the plague. And every so often, some hiker out there or somebody camping out there will contract the plague. It actually does happen. I think I read a report maybe 10 years ago, somebody contracted it. So yeah, and somebody told me, I don't know this, but somebody told me that there's even signs out there that warn you about it. Stay away from the critters because they really could have the plague, and that kind of freaks people out. But yeah, it's for real. The plague, of course, is still in other parts of the world as well. Notably today, it is in India. India tends to have a problem with it. And of course, India has these gigantic mega cities with massive slums, which again leads to a lot of filth and a lot of rats. And yes, the plague does occasionally pop up there. Here is some artwork from the time. And we can see, artists are, I think I've shown this one already. Artists are depicting the plague itself, victims of the plague and treating the plague. You can look in the lower right there. We have a man who is doing something that he believes will treat the plague, and we have the two victims there. And up in the upper left, we see various plague victims and treatment for them. A common belief was that the plague was spread by air, by breathing bad air. And so we know the stories where they would have these masks, and doctors, if we want to call them that, people who were helping, would wear these masks with these big long noses on them with flowers and stuff stuffed in them to filter the air out. And so it's called a plague mask if you look them up. And survivors of the plague, again, it does have a few survivors, about a 2% survival rate. Survivors of the plague were drafted into taking care of plague victims because it was seen as something that they could do since they had survived it. But it's pretty horrible. And by the way, the nobility that walled themselves off obviously were not immune either. We know that there was a lot of death among the nobility. We see other depictions of the plague, and it shows through, and again, in the artistic work, because the world is just falling apart. Everybody is dying. Hell has sort of arrived on earth. Hell is no longer relegated to the underworld that the bad people go to, but hell has reached here, and all of society seems to just be falling apart, and it is incredibly stressful. on society at large. And so people are more prone to violence. People are more prone to antisocial behavior. We see death appear in all kinds of artistic works, skeletons and such. This one here, death is coming and he's going to take everything you have. It's just a very different cultural shift. Here we have some actual plague victims. These are, I believe, from India, but I'm not entirely sure. And you can see it's pretty bad. It's not something you want to get, and it's very, very tragic. There's just no other way to put it. And again, every year a few people do die from it. And I know that in India, whenever there's a little bit of an outbreak, boy, they go in and they just start fumigating everything. It's well known how devastating this can be. Here is some archaeology, where they have exhumed these burial pits that date back to the era to try to do study on it. And by the way, they're quite confident that the bacteria in the ground is now dead. The bodies have been in the ground so long, they're not worried about that anymore. But now, if you were, say, an anthropologist or somebody wanting to study how this affected society, by looking at this, what are a couple of questions you might ask, and what might you be able to derive very quickly from looking at these open grave pits? What would perhaps be one of the first observations you would make? What might you think? Obviously, we got a lot of dead people in there, right? A lot of bones. How about the fact that they're thrown in haphazardly, right? The bodies are not necessarily laid out in a good order. One of these pictures shows that, but the other two, it's very obvious. They're just throwing people in, aren't they? They're not taking the time to line the people up. Now understand, if this is a society that is in such chaos, they're not even going to take the time to put them in the pit properly. They're just going to toss them in one after another. That's pretty scary, isn't it? That tells you about what's happening as these bodies are being deposited. How about they would look at the bodies themselves and say, okay, how old are these people? Right? Is this disease killing, the elderly sick people, or is this disease killing healthy, strong people? And it can be very obvious by looking forensically at these human remains, how old these people were and what kind of general health they were. And it's very obvious, by the way, and they have done, again, quite a bit of study on these remains, that these are people suffering from malnutrition. Serious evidence that these people were very hungry is evident in just about every one of these bodies. So they know there is a famine going on. And your skeletal system, of course, changes whenever you go several years without eating properly. And so you learn a lot by doing this. Well, usually, and I've been giving, lectures on this for a very long time, usually I would say to my students, one of the real takeaways from this is that we need to understand that serious diseases that go through the population and kill mass numbers are still with us, that we don't need to just assume that these type of events are in the past. But I guess I don't need to tell you that, right? We don't need to be taught that now. But the reality is that it's true. The reason why we study this, if you say to yourself, why am I being made to study history? Why do I have to sit in class? Well, it's because we want to be prepared. We want to be ready whenever these things happen in the modern era, because we know that they can. You were put in science classes so you could learn about viruses, so you could protect yourself whenever you were in a potential situation where you could catch one. We study this in history classes, so we know, this happens, and we've got to be ready for it when it can happen again. Education is important. It's there to help. And on that note, the plague is not the only serious pandemic illness that has gone through the human population and killed millions. Before COVID, what was perhaps the plague of the 20th century? What was the disease that went through the population and killed many, many millions of people that most people probably hadn't thought about or even knew about until now? And it was almost exactly 100 years ago. Does anybody know? It was called the Spanish flu. Yeah, now y'all know. Yeah, exactly. It was called the Spanish flu. What happened, nobody really knows where the Spanish flu originated. It didn't originate in Spain, just in case you're wondering. It had nothing to do with Spain. Some think it might have originated in Kansas, actually, but the going belief is that it originated somewhere in Europe, but it was not Spain. What happens is that in 1918, World War I is still going on, and there's millions of soldiers from various parts of the world, including the United States, all over there fighting each other in these nasty, dirty trenches. And the Spanish flu starts breaking out among the soldiers on both sides. And it was a very, very devastating version of influenza. Just the regular flu, only far, far, far more destructive. And it was killing young, healthy men. It was killing the people that ordinarily are not supposed to die from the flu. And it was a serious problem by the end of the war in the rank and file of these armies. And then, of course, when all these soldiers went home, they took it with them. And all across the world, the Spanish flu just starts killing people left and right. And it is killing the healthy people. It is killing young people. And it is estimated to have killed around 40 million by the time it burned itself out. Now understand, World War I killed 25 million. We talk about how horrific World War I was. Actually, the flu that came along after it was worse. So these things happen. And if you go back into your family tree, you're going to see somebody who you are closely related to that was young and healthy and died of the Spanish flu. Every family lost people. Everyone did. So go ahead and do a little genealogy and ask around, and you're gonna see, great grandma died of this or whatever, because it's pretty terrible. And they have since isolated it. They dug up a couple of victims of it that were buried up in Alaska in some permafrost. So they were able to extract the virus and confirm that it is in fact the influenza virus, only a very difficult strain of it. And if we're not talking about the Spanish flu, perhaps something more recent, if I were to say, what is kind of the plague of the modern era? What's the plague of the last few decades that everybody is taught you need to not get and everybody is worried about dying from? What might it be? Because millions of people certainly have it and have contracted it up to this point. What might it be? And this scared the daylights out of people in the 80s and 90s, because I was there. What's that? HIV, exactly, AIDS. The human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, is definitely still very much with us. There are now treatments that can do a pretty good job of keeping you alive. It doesn't kill people. It'll kill you within about 2 years most of the time if gone untreated. But the reality is, if you contract HIV, it's bad. You're not going to be healthy no matter what kind of treatments we have, and you don't want to get it. There's no other way around it. And so, you got to be aware of this stuff. And we know what you got to wear, okay? They can be uncomfortable, and they can slip off, and they can tear, and I know you don't necessarily always want to, but you need to all the time. Wear them. And I'm talking about your pants. Pants. Keep them on. Don't get AIDS. It's bad for you. And of course, all kinds of other STDs out there are pretty terrible too. So be careful. Watch yourself. You're being educated for a reason. And of course, with COVID, we know that COVID is a virus. We know how viruses are spread. It's not rocket science to us anymore. And so anybody who thinks that you shouldn't be wearing a mask, or anybody who thinks that this isn't really going to make a difference, or even if I get it, I'm not going to die, or something like that, that is just pure ignorance. Don't be like that. Okay, protect yourself. And keep in mind also, you're also protecting others. Because even if you do get it, and it doesn't have a serious impact on your health, you can be giving it to somebody else. And so we have that obligation to stop this virus in its tracks, and the only way we're going to do it is by applying the education that we have. I have had 3 friends die of COVID, just to let you know. I've had 3 friends die. And these were healthy people. These were not elderly, sick people. These were people who should not be victims of it. So please, wear your mask, be educated, apply the knowledge that you have, take it seriously. And let's move on, because if you think that the bubonic plague was the only bad thing to happen during this era, unfortunately it's not. As I mentioned, it's a series of events. We also will see the 100 Years' War. We also will see the 100 Years' War. Very quickly, we know that when the king dies, his eldest son becomes the next king. Everybody knows how that works. Kings aren't elected or selected any other way. And of course, if the king doesn't have any sons, the king's brother will become the king. And in some instances, but not during this era, of course, they will start giving the crown to women as well. And That's certainly a good thing, but not during this era. And one of the rules that is very clear, particularly in Central and Western Europe, is that this line of succession is non-negotiable. If you are in line for the throne, you are going to be king. This is not something that somebody can decide that you are not worthy of. It is taught that this is God's will. God chose you. As a matter of fact, in France, the rule is so rigid that if you are the heir to the French throne, you can't turn it down. If you decide, I don't want this, give it to my younger brother, no deal. You must be king regardless. And the argument there, of course, is it creates stability. It makes sure that there isn't going to be chaos and civil war and all of that when brothers decide to fight each other for the throne or whatever. And that, of course, will happen in places like the Ottoman Empire and other parts of the world. Well, why is this important? Well, in 1328, the King of France died, and he didn't have any sons, he didn't have any brothers, there were no close male relatives at all. Nobody to inherit the throne directly related to him. Now that's okay. We can go into the extended family tree and kind of figure out who it's supposed to be. But that's where things get a little bit complicated. When we start looking at distant cousins, who exactly is the correct distant cousin? Based on the traditional interpretation of what to do there, it just so happens that the closest male relative was the King of England, Edward III. Now, you could interpret it more than one way, and it got down to whether or not you can pass that inheritance through a female rather than just the men. But Edward III had a very clear claim to the French throne, and as we already know, nobody gets to contest it. This is God's will. So if he is in line for the throne, he is the king, and there is nothing any of us mere mortals can do about it. So, of course, in 1328, after the death of the French king, Edward III, King of England, declared himself King of France. He, of course, knew that the French would not go for this. And the French chose another relative, although he was from the member of the Valois family. He was also a distant cousin of the previous king, but by a different reading of the family tree, he was the heir. And the French obviously wanted a Frenchman to be the king. Now, as you can probably guess, they did not sit down and negotiate this peacefully. What happened was England invaded. Edward sent in his army to conquer France by force, insisting that he was the rightful king. And it turns out that the English army was pretty darn good. And we will see the beginning of the 100 Years' War, but it actually lasts longer than 100 years. The first generation that started this war dies, the next generation dies, and the plague happens during the middle of all of this. So I'm telling you, this was not a good time to be living in Western Europe. So we eventually end up with different players, different people claiming to be king. It's not really the 100 Years' War so much as it's the 100 Years' Wars, because it kind of ramped up and down over the decades. However, what is known is that the English seem to continue to do well. Two big battles during this war were the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Poitiers, 1346 and 1356. And in both cases, the English won pretty big. And again, the fighting kind of went back and forth, but generally speaking, the English were winning. And it became pretty obvious by about the year 1400 that no matter how this war ends, England is going to have a big chunk of the continent. That it was unrealistic for the French to be able to drive the English out completely. That at some point they're going to have to negotiate. In 1415, it looked like it was going to be over. The Battle of Agincourt, now again, we're jumping many decades ahead here. Keep that in mind. Was a huge English victory. This battle is also considered to be sort of the death blow to the feudal knight. And this is just, I don't know which battle we're talking about here. I wouldn't want to be the guys on the front line of that with the arrows flying, but at Agincourt, what happened is the French knights, with their big armor and on their big horses, very feudal in terms of their organization, went up against King Henry V. England was now ruled by Henry V, and you have to write this down. But Henry didn't have a very big army, and he didn't have a lot of big burly mounted knights. And so what he did is he armed all of his men with longbows, and a small army of longbows just launched all of their arrows into the charging French knights, and it just devastated the French army. A few of them got hit, and they fell down, and then everybody behind them started tripping all over them, and before you know it, just the whole French army was crushed by just a bunch of guys with these very simple weapons. And Agincourt is really kind of seen as that transition when it becomes very obvious feudal knights can no longer win on the battlefield. The weaponry has just become too complex. And toward the very end of the war, we will see the first use of gunpowder weapons. And so that, of course, does it. But Agincourt is that big transition. And here's where Agincourt gets real interesting. And I'll just leave it at this because I know we got to go and you don't have to write anymore. But the exhumation of the casualties at Agincourt, forensic analysis has been done in more recent years on the French dead at Agincourt because they buried them again in these big mass graves and the bones are still in the ground. And what they found was that these French knights were absolutely gigantic. I mean, these guys were Coke machines with heads, okay? They were just huge men, every single one of them. And they also had obviously lived very brutal lives, lots of injuries that had been healed and stuff like that. And what that does is it's given us an insight into exactly who would become a knight. Because if you inherit your title from your dad, there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to see an army that's all big giant men, right? Because, your dad may be big, but that doesn't mean you are. On the other hand, if what we're doing is specifically recruiting the biggest and toughest among us and knighting them, then that would explain the French army. You see where I'm coming from? So does that mean that by 1415, France was kind of desperate and willing to knight any man that was big and strong and willing to fight? Or during the Middle Ages was knighthood not nearly as an exclusive club as we think? I don't know. But it's interesting to study, isn't it? It's interesting to check it out. What we also, of course, see, though, is that it doesn't matter how big and tough you are. If the other guy has the right kind of weapon, it's not going to help you, is it? Right? An arrow from a longbow is going to kill a big guy just as much as it's going to kill a small guy. So that's also part of what we see. We also see during the 100 Years' War the first emergence of what we call modern naval warfare, with ships firing on each other and fighting each other. War is brutal, folks. The best thing to do is avoid it. And the 100 Years' War was definitely that. It was real nasty. Now, if you're wondering, and again, I know we got to go, but I'm making it look like the English won, right? Well, they're not speaking English over in France, are they? And so obviously something's going to change, isn't it? And when I mentioned that the French soldiers were all these big giant men by this point, and France was trying to put muscle on the line, the true irony is that the savior of France is going to be exactly the opposite. The savior of France is going to be a petite little girl who emerges as the real hero. But we got to get to Joan of Arc on Wednesday because we're out of time. All right, everyone, y'all take care. Have a great day, and I'll see you later.